My name is Rory Hardy. I'm a software engineer at Cerner. We're based out of Kansas City, Missouri. We work in the healthcare sector. I myself personally focus heavily on front-end UI componentry and reusable assets. If you're interested in following me on Twitter, my handle's GaneetGeek. If you guys get the joke, sweet. If not, don't worry about it. Just a little bit about me, since I'm assuming no one here knows me. I'm a musician who actually transitioned over to being a computer science major. I play various wind instruments. I'm also a meme and bird fanatic, as you will find out throughout this talk. I have a picture there of my wife, Jessica Zering, and my macaw, Link. His name is Link because he's green, same color as the hero of The Legend of Zelda, and just like the hero of The Legend of Zelda, he doesn't talk very much. Fun fact about this picture, we found out Link didn't like Jess very quickly. In about 10 seconds from that photo being taken, he latched onto her ear and would not let go. Lastly, I am a very spicy hot food fanatic. That's a bowl of 20 ghost peppers. I ate most of them. Anyway, enough about me. We're gonna go ahead and get started with this conference, but I have the weirdest luck with conferences in that I'm either speaking before lunch, before you get out, or before the party. In this case, I'm the party guardian, and as such, I will try to get you guys out of here a bit early. As such, I do ask that questions be held to the end, and I'm gonna be doing questions a little bit differently than you may have experienced through the day. Instead of doing a group Q&A at the end, I'm gonna invite you to come and talk to me one-on-one, either here or at the party. So, dang, I was hoping that was gonna kick on and work. Fine. All right. So the question I want you guys to think about throughout this talk is, when do you write JavaScript? Or better, when should you write JavaScript? This talk is kind of geared in two tracks, both for more senior developers, but also more junior developers. Just a hands, who feels that they're new to web development here? So we got a couple of you, and then I'm assuming the rest probably feel more experienced. So I'm gonna try to target that audience a little bit more, but I will target both. So, when you're working with JavaScript, I've seen people use it for visual presentation, is seen in the first example, maybe a carryover from the days of working with IE6 and 7. If you're still doing that, I'm sorry for you. Or maybe you're using it for interaction, maybe you're using it for both. But just think about when you do it. And I think I know why this isn't clicking now. Let's see. Oh. Google has betrayed me on this. All right, so the other thing about this, I'm gonna use jQuery for some of these slides, just to shrink down the amount of code that has to be on here because it abstracts some boilerplate. But I'm in that previous example where the person was clicking the buttons and the background color was changing. Seriously, in the wild, what I've seen in some modern development as well as legacy development, you'll see someone writing this in JavaScript. And, it's like, well, if someone's coming in new, they haven't done web development before, they've probably heard the principles of separating your concerns, where you have HTML for content, CSS for presentation, and JavaScript for, your behaviors and interactions. Well, user clicking a button, you want to react to them. So, you go over to JavaScript, code it out, meet your requirements, and you move on. I'll come to why that's not necessarily so good in a couple slides here. So using that same example, what I would expect to see would be, of course your content is done in your HTML layer, but you just use CSS. You don't need JavaScript to change the background color when a user hovers over a button, or they click on the button. There's built-in mechanisms to do that. There have been built-in mechanisms to do that for a very long time. That said, every now and then I'll still see this in JavaScript. Now I do want to briefly touch on the fact that, back in the day of like IE6 and 7, sometimes you had to do stuff like this. Maybe not necessarily this specific example, but you would need to use JavaScript in order to smooth over all the differences and variations in your browser. If you take a look at some of the older versions of EXT, they did that in the core API there. Or not the core API, but the core. nowadays they're moving away from that into more modern technology that takes care of these kind of things for you. So, like I mentioned, when people are new to web development, they think, at least they tend to hear the separation of concerns, that HTML for content, CSS for presentation, JavaScript for functionality, and you can really think of those as like various cogs in a mechanism, where if any one of them breaks, the whole system comes crashing down. Or, if progressive enhancement is a thing that, you value, maybe without JavaScript you still get content, which depends on whether you're building websites or complicated web applications that are highly interactive. Depends on what you're building, but really each piece co-interacts with each other. If you think about, writing everything in JavaScript and using no CSS, what's your performance going to be? Versus if you do everything without JavaScript, how much interactivity can there be? So each piece builds atop the other. And when you're more experienced, these thoughts aren't necessarily something that come to you anymore. You've done it so long, it's just second nature. But if you're looking over, junior devs who, or even experienced developers who are just moving from, working in C++ and coming over into the web space, these things may not be familiar. And something to really keep in mind is, was mentioned in the keynote, there's a lot of JavaScript fatigue out there. There's so many tools, so many options, and there's so many different techniques now that these simple things that a lot of us now take for granted are drenched in a sea of a ton of other stuff that's out there. So for someone who's new to it, to try and disseminate those key pieces that are valuable, that can be really difficult. And we need to take the onus on ourselves, as those who have worked with the older browsers, the modern browsers, and have seen how things changed, to communicate that down and make sure that people just know it and they understand it. So just some minor recaps on today's tech and where I've seen JavaScript inappropriately used. If we just take a look at HTML, a long time ago it really was just content. It didn't really give you interactivity. You had to add JavaScript to get it. Beyond clicking a link to navigate to a page and submitting a form and having some processes go on and whatever. So it's fairly common on the front end to see JavaScript libraries used for form validation. Most of the modern browsers today have that built in. To a degree, sometimes you need to kick off to a library to handle special cases, fine. But for the most part, the browsers have this baked in, and you can just hook directly onto that, no JavaScript needed. Unless you want to change the language of it and whatnot, but we're not going to go into that. But you can also directly embed audio and video into your pages now, just using audio and video tags. You used to have to use either Flash or some pretty hefty JavaScript to get that in there. And sorry, something was making weird noises. And just for those who may not be familiar, how they do that is with becoming less of a hack, but custom components and the shadow DOM. If you're not familiar, check it out. It's really cool stuff. And then, of course, with CSS, it used to be pretty much, like I said, use it for basic styling. You couldn't do advanced things with it. You couldn't really program with it. But nowadays, you don't need to use jQuery or vanilla JavaScript or some animation library to handle animations. CSS can do most of that for you, and typically more efficiently than your JavaScript can. Now there are, of course, as with everything, there's exceptions, and there are cases where you can use animation frames in JavaScript to get more performant in that layer. You have to decide for yourself whether that trade-off is worthwhile. I just want to make the point that this can be offloaded to CSS and taken away from JavaScript now. Same thing with three-dimensional transforms and basic layouts. It used to be if you wanted to have really fancy layouts, you would either do it all in JavaScript, you would do floating hacks or some combination thereof, and it could be difficult to maintain and keep it consistent across multiple devices easily. Nowadays they have things like Flexbox, and coming down the pipe are CSS grids, and they're they're very simple in contrast to the ways that we approached it in the past. Again, taking JavaScript out of the equation. Just as a quick demo, it's going to make me do it this way. There we go. So I just wanted to show this tiny little demo, not developed by me, but it's really, really cool. It's just a little NES. You hover over it, it pops open. You can even turn it on and off. And of course, you can do the little reset flicker. There is 0 JavaScript on this page. Basically, how this is working is through a checkbox and some clever CSS. How fun. So, and then of course, I've been talking about JavaScript. Well, so the title of the talk was, "It's great, but stop writing it." I never said stop using it. It's very important to create rich applications and high levels of user interactivity, especially, if you want to get into single page applications. In this case here, we just have a little demo tree map that has some filtering options and some drill down, drill up options. Wouldn't be able to do this in just HTML or CSS alone. I could take a HTML table and use clever CSS to give you that base, the top level. But after that, in order to get the additional functionality, I have to have JavaScript. Now, I have a few options when working with JavaScript. I can write it myself, or I can offload to solutions that are already built, such as, doesn't want to change pages again, such as jQuery. Now, I'm not saying jQuery is necessarily the tool that we are going to use moving forward, but I believe most likely everyone here has at least heard of jQuery. I probably could have mentioned D3 given the note in the keynote and the fact that that tree map example was written with D3. But point aside, jQuery's been around a long time, and it got a boom in popularity back in the days of IE6, IE7, IE8, where the browsers were just so different in their underlying implementations that it was too much work for developers to really think about, well, I have this business case that I need to solve, but I need to solve it this way for this browser, this way for this, it was too much work. jQuery came along to smooth all of that out, abstracted it all away from you, gave you a very clean, simple API that you could use. But I do want to make the point that jQuery is not a replacement for JavaScript. And that is definitely something I've seen over the years. I have seen on resumes, I have talked to people, and what I hear is, I'm a really good JavaScript developer. I know jQuery inside and out. And whenever I hear that, I go, well, jQuery is not JavaScript. It's written in JavaScript. It abstracts on the document object model for you. And it gives you a few, handy like object copying mechanisms and whatnot. But it's not really JavaScript, the language. It's its own API that sits atop of it. Maybe you write vanilla JavaScript along with it, but it's not the same thing. And when we get to the next section of this talk, I'm going to come into why learning vanilla JavaScript, even when you have these frameworks like jQuery going even further into like EXT, why it's still valuable and important. But I want to just reiterate, jQuery is not JavaScript, but it's something I keep hearing over and over. People doing. Now let's see, how are we doing on time? So I said I'd get you out early. All right. We are doing good enough that I can just give you guys a quick mental break. I mentioned I liked birds, right? And memes. This bird's better than Party Parrot.
Yeah! Go Snowball!
Right? Better than Party Parrot? Moving on. So now I talked about taking JavaScript kind of out of your pipeline, delegating it to other technologies or to frameworks and tools. And basically, like I said, it's not necessarily that you don't ever use it, it's that you stop writing it yourself or that you minimize what you write. But inevitably, at some point, we're going to have to write it, right? I mean, whether you're using ext that handles a lot of things for you, or you're using something like React, which handles specific use cases for you, you're going to have to write some stuff yourself. So this is a little cliche, but learn JavaScript. I know that's the saying, learning X will make you better at X, but really learning the language itself enables you to do a few things. It enables you to use these other tools that are built atop of it better. You know, if you know how the event handling system in JavaScript works, when you go into jQuery and you deal with its event system, or you work with React's event system, or any other event system, you have an idea of what they're doing under the hood without ever going and touching that code. It also gives you the opportunity to learn various design paradigms. All of these different libraries use different techniques to give you solutions that are meaningful, but a lot of people don't know how they do it. For example, jQuery. When they switched from the 1.0 branch to the 2.0 branch, pretty much everyone's stuff kept working, but they ripped out a ton of code, because they stopped supporting, you know, the really old browsers that forced it to be as bloated as it was. How did they do that? Well, they used a few design patterns, the key one being the Facade Pattern, which in short, basically what you do is you write a very simple API for users. So selector.onClick, right? On, the on method, effectively delegates out to an internal bind method, which is much more complicated. But you, the user of that library, never ever touch that code directly. You use the Facade, which frees them up to completely rewrite that under the hood, so long as the contract of the API can stay the same. So they can make these massive changes without you ever having to rewrite your code. And those are really powerful lessons to learn that if we just use these frameworks, we might miss. This has probably been said a bajillion times by thousands of people, but read JavaScript, the good parts. I've heard people say that, you know, with ES6 coming out and ES7 or ES 2017 right around the corner, it's not relevant. Personally, I really disagree with that. I think it's still relevant today, and it will be relevant tomorrow. Because what he does is he really does a great job of calling out the weird little quirks in this language that, you know, if you're writing vanilla JavaScript, you may encounter at some point. As mentioned in the keynote, there's a ton of tools. Seriously, there's a ton of tools, and they make your job easier. We'll get into that a little bit later, but seriously, tools. So many tools. And then leverage libraries and frameworks, but use them when they solve your problem. To exemplify that, a couple of years ago, I came across a blog, and I wanted to just go to it on my phone, but it took like 30 seconds to load. And I was like, oh man, this is terrible. So I went to my desktop and looked at it, and sure enough, this blog, which, by the way, I should preface, like, the most interactivity is clicking links and going to another page. There was no need for it to be a single page application written in Angular, but it was a single page application written in Angular. So, you know, on the first time I loaded it, it was really slow. And it was basically just, you know, pictures and written content. So what was Angular really solving there? Because the web has been really good with links, and, you know, back-end languages have been really good at handling, dealing with those kind of routing mechanisms for years. Why do we suddenly need to package it all in the browser for these users when that's all I need, that's all I want? You know, I tried to figure it out if there was like something else they were doing, but to the best of my knowledge of looking through their source code, the only thing they really needed JavaScript for was Google Analytics. But they were serving up, you know, Angular, which, if I remember right, Angular 1 came to around like 80-ish kilobytes minified, and then, you know, it has to pull in all the other assets, move it all together, you know, hook it up. There's a lot going on there. that was frustrating. And again, Angular's great, React's great, EXT is great. They're all very good, and they are very good at solving the problems they're built for. But you have to think, do I want to pull in this entire framework to click a button? But that's kind of the thing. So then talking about writing JavaScript a little bit better when you have to do it, avoid the global namespace. Just don't touch it. In ES5, everything is global, and you don't have, when I say everything is global, I mean if you just write var x equals whatever, that's global, unless you put it inside of a function, because JavaScript only had function scope. In ES6, you have some new options that give you local scope without functions, and you have ES6 modules, which really, really help you with not touching the global namespace. But unfortunately, a lot of us still either support older browsers and we have to transpile down, or we're not ready to use ES6 because it's really new. Whatever the reason is, just avoid globals, because for example, if I chose to use the $sign for a framework I'm building, and then someone pulls in jQuery, well, we got problems. If my application leverages some, higher level variable, and someone pulls something in that also uses that, we're gonna have problems. I don't like my applications being like a plane crash. Not my thing. So I mentioned JavaScript has events internally. I can bind a unique handler to every single little piece of logic on my page. I can, for example, using this functionality here, I can add custom logic for the add button, and then every single one of those close buttons can have their own piece of logic associated with them too, uniquely. That's a lot of rewriting. That's a lot of redundancy. I don't want to do that. So instead, I can add an event listener to take care of that, which in some ways is basic programming. But if you've worked a lot with these frameworks, you don't necessarily touch this anymore. And then of course you introduce things like React, where they tell you, oh hey, go ahead and write on click directly on your element in JSX. But under the hood, they schmooze over it, and it's very different than if you write on click on an element directly in HTML. And take that further. Use event delegation. Event delegation is basically, well, let me just pull up the example. So I have a bunch of buttons and each one triggers a pop-up. I can have an event listener for each individual one, and then every time I add a new one to the page, I have to add a new listener for it. Or I can just write some generic logic and say, hey, for any of these that are on the page now or in the future, do this. And that again simplifies your code. Frameworks like jQuery and React and Angular and all of them, they help simplify this. But just in vanilla JavaScript, that's effectively how you're writing it and how it works. It's very worth learning, and like I said, learning this stuff will help you use these frameworks better. The next thing is, I know there's been a few talks about testing. Seriously, use a linter. Is like your first line of defense in your tests. There's a funny little story about this specific code snippet here. This was code that a friend had written into his Angular application. He called me after about 19 hours of debugging, and he was like, can you look at this code with me, please? It's been spin locking for 19 hours, and I can't see the problem anymore. I can't find it. And so he and I just start going through the code, and I end up seeing this. And I told him, this is probably your problem. You're reusing that I variable. And he was like, oh my God, of course that's my problem. Now he had just come from C++, which if you do this in C++, you have block scoping, and it would work as anticipated. In ES6, instead of var, he used let, it would have worked how he anticipated, but he was working in ES5, so all he had was var. He was overloading the iterator variable, and thus infinite loop. Now, 19 hours, that's a lot of developer time, especially when you are the key developer at a startup. That's really painful. And The point about linters, yeah, they would have caught that in about less than 5 seconds, unless your code base is terrifying. So what are linters? They are little code libraries that perform static analysis on your code. They look at the code as is for common mistakes or style guides or both. Missing semicolons, double nesting your for loop on the same iterator, things like that. It's very, very fast, much faster than unit tests or integration tests. But they're great for just finding those little things. There's a lot of options out there. The very first one that was written for JavaScript was by Douglas Crockford. It's mentioned in that book, JavaScript: The Good Parts, and that was JSLint. People eventually forked it, not being totally happy with how opinionated it was, and they came up with JSHint. And then, eventually someone came up with ESLint. My personal preference is ESLint. It's incredibly flexible, without really any shenanigans with it. It'll even work with JSX. So that's good in my book. The next thing for writing good JavaScript, when you do have to do it, is writing unit tests. You wouldn't believe how many times I hear people go, but it's JavaScript, I don't test that. Or my favorite, it's JavaScript, I can't test that. So I had mentioned that staying out of the global namespace is a good thing. A common way in ES5 to do that is to wrap the entire code base in an immediately, or a self-executing anonymous function. So cool, everything in your app is out of the global namespace, you're good to go. Unfortunately, as a result, you either have to have a way of unwrapping it or exporting your private logic out so that you can run it in unit tests. Well, that's where using different design patterns would come in handy, so that you don't have the excuse of, well, it's JavaScript, so I can't test it. It's really just write it differently. And of course, with ES6 and ES6 modules, well, it gets even easier, right? You can just import them, the individual functions, directly into your testing framework and go from there. Much simpler. And I guess the last thing on unit testing that I want to say is, don't conflate your unit tests with integration tests. Jasmine, Mocha, QUnit, they're really great for testing your functions and your core functionality. But as soon as you start running them in a headless browser, and you're like, all right, when I click this button, this happens, then this happens, following that trail in those libraries gets very difficult. Those aren't really unit tests, right? Those are more functional tests. You'll want to use things like Selenium or Sauce Labs in order to deal with that kind of testing, and you'll be a lot happier that you did in the long run. So I also wanted to talk about libraries and frameworks a little bit more. I wanted to reiterate on that point about writing less. Less is more. So Bootstrap, in a lot of ways, gives you just reusable styles, but it also gives you reusable components, right? Like if I remember right, they have like an image carousel, they have tooltips, they have modals. Under the hood, there's JavaScript there. But you as a developer go, oh, well, I want this component, and just pop it right in the page. You're done. You're good to move on. Now if you're someone who has a lot of experience, maybe you don't want to use Bootstrap's modals. You have a different library you want to use. You're familiar enough to pull that in, wire it up, or write your own. But if you're someone new, where are you going to go? You're probably going to go to Google. How do I make a modal? How do I look at those? What do I do? And then who knows what they're going to land on. So if you're not using something like Bootstrap or EXT or Kendo UI or any of the other, myriad of solutions that are out there, and you're writing your own, think about reusable components. One of the things I really like about React is that it, by the nature of writing React components correctly, they push you to write reusable components. If I need an alert in React, I'd write a generic alert that I could tweak via props. Versus, all right, I have these requirements, I need to satisfy them right now. Boom, done for this one single solution. Let's see. So repurpose, right? So the JavaScript for whatever Bootstrap is giving you or these other frameworks is giving you, I mean, it's written. It had to be written, but it had to be written once. From there on, you're able to drop it in. You're able to just reuse it. And the benefit of that is you're way less likely to introduce bugs. If you have people who are new to the code base, it's much easier for them to learn it and become effective in it quickly. And if there is a bug, instead of, n number of people having to rewrite something, you push up a change once, boom, it scaffolds out to everybody, and you save a bunch of time. So, again, try to think about how someone new to web development is thinking about it. I know a lot of people in this room are not new to it, but that means chances are you're working with someone who is. So remember that, chances are, if it's their first day coming to web development, they've probably heard separation of concerns. They probably haven't heard too much else. They've probably heard, React and Angular 2 are the best things on the planet. Maybe don't know a whole lot about them. Maybe, if they've looked into one and not the other, chances are someone's probably heard of Grunt or Gulp, which one's better? How do I choose? My favorite way of phrasing this with all the tools that are out there is, well, which one is currently helping you solve your problems? Or which one do you know well enough to solve your problems? Because that's probably your right choice. There are some underlying differences between Grunt and Gulp, but unless you have very specific use cases, chances are you could use one or the other. Or you could use NPM scripts. There's so much out there. Focus on what's helping you or what you know can help you, as opposed to spending a ton of time just chasing the latest and greatest. At Cerner, we recently adopted ES6, and it was very funny. At our last web developer meetup, someone, without fail, was like, so what about Yarn? We're using NPM, but Facebook released Yarn like 30 minutes ago. It was the same. It was literally the same day it was released. I think, like I said, maybe half an hour-ish. Someone's like, what about Yarn? Can we look at that? And Yarn is awesome. I've been checking it out, but the problem was on that day, in that day, it had about 170 issues logged to it. Do I really want to use that for developing towards production? Whereas, NPM's been out for a long time. I know what pitfalls it has. I know what caveats it has, and that's what I've been using. So that was kind of, in summary, what I explained to that developer in that meetup. Was, yeah, it looks really good. I'd like to use it someday. But it's so new, I don't want to use it for production stuff today. Right? So again, there's always going to be new stuff. I think there's a new framework every 16 minutes. I'd like that to be a joke, but it's not. Or at least framework or tool. So you just think back. What is solving my problems? If I'm writing something custom, why am I writing it custom? Is there something that solves this problem? Test anything that you write yourself. And at the end of the day, just understand that JavaScript is an awesome, beautiful, powerful, expressive language that has the potential to reach millions to billions of users and use it responsibly. That's the end of my talk, by the way.